So the talk you saw this morning is a very polished keynote. I've done it a few times. You're seeing the first draft of this talk because it's one I've wanted to do for a while, ever since this bit of nuttery coming up about the idea we should put data centers in space. Like, I got to do the numbers on this. And the only way I'm going to get around to doing it is by making an hour on it. That's just the way I work. My name is Richard Campbell. I make a lot of podcasts. Any .NET Rocks listeners in the room? Oh, that's awesome. My friend Carl Franklin started the show .NET Rocks back in 2002, which is about 3 years before the word podcast existed. That's why we called it an internet audio talk show, because we're not clever enough to come up with the word podcast. And we just passed 2,000 episodes. Every week, sometimes more than once a week, talking to a luminary in the industry, just trying to understand what .NET developers need to know today. And that's an ever-evolving subject area. Needless to say, AI is a big part of it. I also make a show called Run As Radio for sysadmins, because I felt like the content available for sysadmins was terrible back in the day. Of course, starting a sysadmin show in 2007, just as Vista shipped, seemed like a good idea. But that one's every Wednesday since April 11th, 2007. And for a brief interval, while we weren't sure if .NET rocked or not, we made the tablet show, where we were mostly talking about mobile and tablet content. Eventually rolled that back into .NET Rocks. And if you are a .NET Rocks listener, then you know I make these shows called Geek Outs. And the Geek Outs are whatever geeky subject the audience wants. There's over 100 of them now. And for a while there, I was doing one almost every month. And it's where this whole class of talk comes from, because back in 2017, I did a talk about building bases on the moon. It was derived from a European Space Agency paper that I'd read, which I thought was pretty cool. And so turned into an hour-long talk about what's actually practical about building stuff on the moon. And admittedly, this is almost 10 years ago now. And then a few months later, I get a call from NASA, which is a pretty good day, right? And to be clear, it was an email. An email I ignored at first, because come on. But no, it was really a nasa.gov email. And I finally got Charlie on the phone. I'm like, hey, what can I do for you? He says, hey, we really like your podcast about building bases on the moon. I'm like, cool, thanks. That's awesome. And he's, well, we were wondering if you'd ever consider doing a talk about building bases on the moon. I'm like, I guess. Now, I didn't know that, I spent a lot of time doing talks. He thought I was a podcast. You see, do you know PowerPoint? We kind of like PowerPoint at NASA. I'm like, yeah, Charlie, I know PowerPoint. I could probably make that work. He says, well, we'd love it if you come down and talk to us. And I'm like, to you? Yeah. NASA? Yeah. It's your stuff. Right? Yeah, we know. It's like, okay, so you want me to talk to you about your stuff. Yeah. Okay. So later that year, I went down to the Ames Research Center that's outside of San Francisco. This was the big board in the front of the property as you drive in. My mother loves this picture. She's very proud. And I did this presentation about building bases on the moon to a bunch of moon guys, which was an interesting experience. And then we got to tour the facility, which was awesome. Really a cool place. And then the other conferences found out that I'd done this talk for NASA. And they're like, why would you do that talk for us? And I'm like, because it's not about software development. I'm like, yeah, you should do that talk for us. I'm like, okay. So I've done a few space talks over the years. And then because the Geek Outs were big on alternative energy, I've also done a few alternative energy ones as well. And so this talk falls into that category. It's very, very much Geek Out talk, although much more relevant to us today, since all of us are using this technology, and there's a group of folks out there that thinks we ought to put these things into space. So I'm telling you all this to say, I've done a lot of work on space-related data. I knew where to research to say, what's it going to take to do this? What's really feasible? Like, these don't look like space-based things, right? These are large concrete buildings with a lot of cooling and a lot of backup power. Like, you can't fly that into space. Like, that doesn't make any sense at all. Not that people aren't trying. So there's a group, a Y Combinator startup. They're now calling themselves Star Cloud. And late last year, they actually launched an H100 GPU into space. It was on one of the SpaceX rideshare missions called Bandwagon 4. This is in November. There was 18 microsatellites on it. And one of it was Star Cloud 1. There you see it leaving. And it's got an H100 on it. So it's actually the most compute ever put into space at once. It's one GPU. They have run a nano GPT on it just to prove the point. It's only going to last less than a year, about maybe 11 months. Nanosats have limited functionality. So it's cool, but it's not particularly practical. And like I said, StarCloud's work is part of Y Combinator. So they've made a filing to the FCC to fly 88,000 satellites, which seems unlikely. That's really a lot of satellites. They also did these mock-up drawings, these animations of giant 5 gigawatt data centers. The data center is the little thing in the middle. The rest is all the solar panels you'd need to generate 5 gigawatts. 4 square kilometers of solar panels. And they had these same little animations of this thing coming up, little ship coming up and deploying modules of compute that would attach to that data center piece in the middle of it. This is infinitely impractical. That's a lot of satellites, or a lot of solar panels. You're going to have to lift them up in segments and assemble them. You're probably going to want to put this out in geostationary orbit, which is a bit tricky, difficult to get to. You're probably not going to be able to dodge a lot of micrometeoroids along the way, so expect it to take a beating. This is not how you're going to do this, right? It's cool, makes for good visuals, but it's not very practical. The orbit matters. And we talk about different categories of orbit when it comes to satellites. Geostationary is special at 35,786 kilometers up. At that altitude, your spacecraft is orbiting at the same rate that the planet is rotating. So effectively, it creates this illusion that directly over the equator, the satellite is just hovering there. And it's far enough away that if you set up 3 satellites at 120 degrees apart, you can cover the whole planet. So we generally put satellites up there only for stuff like weather, certain categories of one-way broadcast, because they're also 600 milliseconds away. Latency matters, and the speed of light, tough to beat. And so you wouldn't want to do telecom out of there because you got a half a second delay for everything, and that gets really annoying very, very fast. Now, medium altitude is above 2,000 kilometers below geostationary. That's a nice orbit for, again, very much one-way communications because you're talking, at least 100 milliseconds or so of latency. The satellites you usually find up there are stuff like GPS satellites, GLONASS, those types of satellites in arrays. They do fly in a grid around the planet, mostly just sending signals down. They don't take a lot of signals up. Low Earth orbit is where it's at when it comes to communication because you get the ping time down, right? Down to 20 milliseconds or so. That's the exciting space to be in. And that's what's getting very crowded because we want those satellites to be in tight. Now, the downside to LEO is atmospheric drag. There's not a lot of atmosphere at 400 or 500 kilometers. There's also not none, right? It's very tenuous atmosphere and it changes. As we get different levels of solar radiation, as our sun acts up and emits coronal mass ejections and things like that, it actually makes the atmosphere expand. It energizes it, makes better aurora borealis. That's all energy coming from the sun. And that increased energy makes the atmosphere expand and increase drag on satellites, alter their orbits. So we can't compute low Earth orbits a long way in advance. We have to constantly monitor them and keep track of them. One more aspect about orbital mechanics that's important for us if we think about using these devices is, especially in low Earth orbits, inclination. So it's basically the angle relative to the planet of how we're going to orbit. This is a flat visualization for the International Space Station. And you can see it goes fairly far north and fairly far south. That's a 51-degree inclination. That's where the International Space Station is. And that's to make sure that it flies over Russia, who wants to be able to do command control on their modules. If you put it in a 0-degree inclination, which you can do, that's directly equatorial. That's where all your geostationary satellites are. They need to be directly over the equator. If you go 90 degrees, well, not exactly 90 degrees because of weird things, you can do a polar orbit. So now you're flying pole to pole. That's where spy satellites go. They want to be able to map the entire terrain, and so they'll be up in high inclination orbits. It takes more energy. It's more complicated to get there. Now, the biggest satellite network we've got today is Starlink. And Starlink, this started back in 2019. It was commercial by 2021. By December of 22, they had 1 million customers. Today, they have 10 million customers, right? And this is internet downlink for remote areas. They've launched about 12,000 satellites total, of which 9,400 are operational, 9,500, depending on how you do the math. They basically come in 2 different generations, about 3,000 of the generation 1s, and about 7,500 of the Generation 2s. And the Generation 2, what they call a V2 Mini, to still fly on a Falcon 9. They're about 800 kilos each, and maybe roughly 4 meters by 2 meters. So big, thin, heavy, but not particularly huge. It's important to note that 9,600 satellites that Elon's operating, the total number of satellites for the rest of the world combined is about 4,600. So he operates more satellites than the rest of the world combined. There's an argument that we've only flown 10,000 satellites before Starlink, and they've flown 12,000. No signs of stopping anytime soon. But Starlink's essentially done. Their goal is actually to get to about 12,000 satellites by this year, and that'll be considered operationally complete. They weren't supposed to finish this before Starship flew, but Starship's been taking its time, if you've been following that. So we want to build a data center in space. We got to start with a computational unit. That little single H100 is not going to cut it. We can't fly a whole data center. That's way too big. So let's pick a unit of work that we can do the math on. And this is what I spent a lot of time figuring out on. So I picked the NVL72 from NVIDIA. It's about a $3 million unit. It's a 50U rack space. It's a complete unit with a set of Grace processors, 36 Grace CPUs, 72 Blackwells, and it can do about 720 petaflops. So they can handle a trillion parameter GPT, right? A GPT-4 would run inside this one rack. Now, normally, when you talk about an AI data center, you've got dozens of these, even hundreds of these connected together with InfiniBand to do your big model builds. But again, that's too big for us to lift. One of these racks should be able to do inference for us. So I don't think we're ever going to be able to build models in space, but we could move the inference workload up there. There's still some problems. Let's work our way through it. A couple other important numbers if we're going to think of this in terms of space. Yes, it's liquid cooled, and we're going to need to do that because cooling's really a problem in space. It's about 135 kilowatts of electricity per rack. That's going to make for some interesting numbers. And it's 1.3 metric tons, right? I know that number from their specs because you've got to care about that stuff when you put it on a lifted floor. All right, so we got our trillion parameter model. Let's talk about building satellites. Building satellites is easy. Here's how the GPS-2 satellite works. I love Lockheed Martin, but let's be clear. Satellite construction is a very specialized art. There's lots of pieces involved. And I'm going to walk you through all of this, not with this graphic. This graphic was designed to scare you, and it worked. Let's start with the bus side, okay? We've defined the payload. The payload is at NVL72. So now, what's all the ingredients that makes a satellite work? Well, you need some kind of structure to hold it together, typically made of aluminum, as light as you can possibly get it. You're going to need command control computers that are going to deal with your power management. They're going to deal with the pointing systems, how we keep it aimed the right direction, do your health monitoring, telemetry, all of that sort of stuff. Not big. Those are little pieces. Attitude, determination, and control. So I need to figure out which way I'm flying. I don't want to be tumbling. I need to be able to keep my solar panels pointed in the right direction and collect electricity. My cooling system pointed in the shade to be able to disperse cooling. I need to be able to communicate with some things. And I got to do that by knowing where I am. And so on satellites, there's a bunch of different systems. The first is their inertial management system. So this is a set of spinning gyroscopes, and they calculate the orientation of the spacecraft very precisely. The problem is that it's accurate, it's relative. So it drifts over time. The drag from the environment, all those sorts of things affect its location. And so to correct the IMUs, we also have star trackers and sun trackers. So the star trackers are cameras, telescopes really, that know the particular pattern of stars. And so when they see a particular pattern of stars, they know roughly from the IMU what orientation they're in. They can compute, that's that set of stars, we must be here. Unless the sun's around, then they can't see stars at all. And then the sun tracker kicks in, but it knows what time of day we are and roughly what our orientation is. And so it can say, oh, if I see the sun there, that's here. Those two bits of information combined, routinely updated every few minutes, depending on where we are in our orbit, gets loaded to the IMU, keeps us in an orientation we understand. They also will put GPS antennas on these satellites and communicate with the GPS network, which is just listen to the GPS network, which would be above us. If we're in LEO, it's in MEO, so we should be able to precisely target on that as well. Those combination of things let us know where we are and how we're oriented.
From that, now we want to modify that. We want to change our pointing angle. We want to keep tracking, perhaps do some maneuvering to avoid collisions with things. Your principal device is a thing called a reaction wheel. There's a set of 3 of them, and as they have momentum in them. So if they're set at different orientations, and if you accelerate one, it will force the satellite to rotate in different directions. And so you keep varying the spin on that to keep your orientation correct. But over time, they'll spin faster and faster and faster until they become saturated as fast as they're safe to spin. And then you actually need to desaturate them, allow them to spin down while not messing up the orientation. Typically, this would be done with reaction controls, little jets. But because we're in low Earth orbit, we can use magnetorquers, which is a great name. And a magnetorquer is essentially an electromagnet that we can fire against the gravity well of the Earth to force the vehicle to rotate and desaturate the gyros. And so that combination of the gyros and the magnetorquers allow us to maintain orientation against our attitude control system. We're also going to have some kind of propulsion system. And that propulsion system is going to allow us to change or modify our orbit as we need to, do collision avoidance, that sort of thing. Typically, they're done with hypergolic fuels. There's 2 compounds that are very poisonous, but when you combine them, they make a little burst of energy. And so you bend them on a nozzle, very precise. You can do maneuvering that way. There's also electrical thrusters, or what they call Hall effect thrusters. That's what Starlink uses. Very lightweight, very low power. It doesn't move the satellite very much, but it's very efficient. They last. You go through fuel slowly with that. So those are all the bus elements. Every satellite has these things, especially a low Earth satellite. So we've got this chassis. We're going to be able to fit that big computer into it as our payload. And this chassis is going to be able to point in the directions we need to point, do our maintenance orientation operations. Now we've got to feed the payload. The first thing we need to feed the payload is power. And we need 135 kilowatts to feed the payload. The math is pretty straightforward. When you're in low Earth orbit and you visit view of the sun, you get 1,356 watts per square meter of energy from the sun. You use triple or quad junction solar panels, the expensive kind, you're probably going to be able to haul about 300 watts per square meter out of that. You need 135 kilowatts. So that adds up to about 450 square meters of solar panel, or 4 arrays roughly 30 meters long and 7.5 meters wide. Big. Space station big, though. The space station runs on about 140 kilowatts. So if you think about the space station's arrays, we can use a little bit more modern than the ones that are used on the space station. It's not unprecedented. They're going to be pretty large and heavy. They're going to have to roll out. But we've made power plants that big. So we're right in the realm. That's enough power to run that rig. Next problem, we need to cool the rig. How much cooling do we need? 135 kilowatts. You put 135 kilowatts of energy into the fancy rocks, you get 135 kilowatts of heat back out. Now, I know the movies tell us space is cold, and nominally that is overall, but the reality is you're in a vacuum. You're in a vacuum bottle. There is no convection here. There is no conduction here. You have to radiate your heat off, and that's hard to do. It's a very slow process to radiate heat off. So the way you do it is with ammonia. You pump ammonia through the blocks to pick up the heat. It vaporizes into a gas. The phase change absorbs a lot of energy. And then you pump it out through plates sticking out the back of the spacecraft to radiate that heat into space. This is the same, again, as a space station. I'll actually show you the space station system for this. That's a pretty big array. We're going to need 2 of those. Each one of these does about 70 kilowatts of heat dissipation. So we need a pair of these to push the heat back out. By the way, we got, what, 1.5 tons worth of compute? Maybe a ton or so worth of chassis with the fuel and so forth. This is 3 tons of solar panels, 6 tons of cooling. So if you're keeping up, we're coming on about 12 tons. That's big. It's not insane, but it's complicated. Next up, we need to communicate. So we provide power and cooling to the rack. Now we need to move data in and out of the rack. Now, traditionally, if we were on the ground, these things would be connected together with InfiniBand, right? InfiniBand comes in like 3 flavors these days: 400 gigabit, 800 gigabit, 1.6 terabit. We really don't have communication tech that fast. The fastest working communication tech we have right now in space actually comes from Starlink, and it is their optical mesh system. These are 100 gigabit communication lasers. Now, so it's very Dr. No, we're putting lasers in space, but these actually work, and they can move about 100 gigabits of data. Now, they're not like InfiniBand, because InfiniBand has stunningly low latency. Like normally, you'd be binding these racks together with InfiniBand, moving 400 gigs at sub-millisecond speeds. We still have to deal with the speed of light in orbit, so we're going to talk about 5 to 10 milliseconds at least just between the satellites. So we're not going to be able to bind these racks together as if they were on the ground. There's no way to do that. We're going to have to stick with the inference model. And we don't actually have to move that much data up and down. The initial load of the model, that's going to take some time, but 100 gigabits should be enough to communicate back to the ground. We're probably not going to do it directly. With these satellites, we'll most likely be communicating through Starlink, and Starlink will provide the downlink for us, which is why SpaceX is in a very good place for making all of this happen. So put a set of lasers on. Like, you could put more than one. You probably will. They don't consume a lot of power, and they're not terribly heavy, right? In theory, you could gang 4 of them together and get 400 gigabits, but the latency is going to kill you here in terms of actual performance for building models. But from the inference perspective, if we're going to use this with more than one person at a time, we're going to need a 1 or 2 laser uplinks for each of those, connecting into to Starlink, downlinking to people. So you're doing your queries, they're going through Starlink, up through the network, relaying to one of these satellites, doing the processing for a certain amount of time, relaying back down. Last component. For a normal satellite in low Earth orbit, your orbit period's about 90 minutes. 45 minutes of that's going to be in sunlight, 45 minutes of that's going to be in dark. So if you want that to work, you need big-ass batteries, 135 kilowatts worth of it, right? And I'm budgeting, yeah, it's only 45 minutes, so we could do slightly less. I don't think we should. We're probably going to need that all. We probably won't actually do this, because even high-density batteries here, we're talking about 1.5 tons worth of battery. But then we also have to put on the charging equipment, and fast charging those batteries in 45 minutes needs a lot more cooling. So it might only be 1.5 tons of batteries, but it's probably another couple of tons of cooling equipment. There's an alternative. Use the right orbit. We can use an orbit that's always in the sunlight, and I'll talk about that in a sec. So I've put the components together. There's a couple of mock-ups of what this satellite might look like. This is one from SpaceX, the 4-array approach with the big block in the middle. I don't know why they got lightning bolts on it. I think AI went nuts on this one. That's not how that works. Another one that came from Elon, from their site directly, was what they called the AI Sat Mini, which I love because it's sitting beside a Starship V3, which for the measure, that's 140 meters. So actually, I think my math's about right. Instead of doing 4 30-meter panels, he's doing 2 60-meter panels plus a bit. See the white parts in the middle? That's the radiator system. So I think I've mapped this out pretty well. It's the right amount of cooling, roughly the right amount of power to run a rack. In Elon's specs on these, he was talking about 100 kilowatt rigs. So I'm going a little bit bigger because the NVL72 is 135, but we're in the ballpark. And we skip the batteries by flying in a sun-synchronous orbit. So sun-synchronous orbit is a special kind of polar orbit. You actually launch at 98 degrees, not 90. At 98, you're a little past the maximum, and it's because the gravitational effects of the Earth distort your orbit. You're going across the bulge in the middle of the planet, and so that offset helps you stay in place. But you also launch right at the night-day terminator, so that around 300-400 kilometers up, you'll be in sunlight all of the time. That's cool. We don't have to deal with batteries. We're always in sunlight. Makes our cooling problems a little bit more challenging. You're going to put that big array out the back in the shade to try and dissipate enough heat. You'll always have power, but you're limited to essentially one inclination of orbit. So we only got so much room here, right? And if we go higher, it slows down our communication. So we only have a certain range, like we're limiting the amount of space. Also, when you're in polar orbits like this, you also have other inclination orbits that are crossing. So we're going to have to talk about collision challenges here because it's not a simple problem to deal with all this. We're also, again, I think we came up to about a 70 to 150 meter wide satellite coming somewhere between 12 and 15 metric tons. Now, that's not an unprecedented size of satellite. There are military spy satellites that are bigger than that. There are no commercial satellites that big. The biggest commercial satellite is actually a brand new one, the Jupiter 3. It's about 9.5 metric tons. But we're in the ballpark. Like the math more or less makes sense for this, right? That we can go, if we go into the sun synchronous orbit, we can put a certain number of satellites up here with sufficient spacing, interfacing with the Starlink network and push it down. But a 12-ton satellite, that's heavy. You know, those Starlinks are only about 800 kilos each, right? As Falcon 9 can launch 25 to 28 of the Starlinks, it's only going to lift one of these data center satellites at 12.5 metric tons. If we switch up to the Vulcan Heavy, we could get to 5 of them. If we go over and talk to our friends at Blue Origin, who aren't very happy at the moment, Blue Origin, the New Glenn could only lift 3. Starship V3 could lift 8. So to get to that big data center on the ground with several hundred of those racks is a lot of flights to sort of densify that. And it does speak to, like, how many satellites do you want to fly on this? How many of these data centers do we need? Elon talking about millions. The Starblock guy said 88,000. Like, that's just a lot of satellites. You know, we've already dealing with an awful lot of satellites these days. And so I asked the logical question, like, how many satellites are too many satellites? Like, what is the reasonable limit? Like, we're looking at a map of all of the debris orbiting the Earth right now, more or less. It's a few years out of date. So start with Starlink, right? They want to get to 12,000 satellites, and they probably will this year, which is great. It's just understand that that's more satellites than everybody else combined, but not for much longer. You know, SpaceX told the FCC they could go up to 34,000 satellites, but these days they're talking about, we're just going to finish this network up to 12,000, and we think we're good. Like that's going to be sufficient for now. But Amazon is working on LEO, formerly Project Kuiper, and they've already flown 300 satellites. They're supposed to fly on New Glenn, which that's going to be difficult. Like if you've been following the news, there was one of the biggest explosions that's ever happened on a pad ever in the New Glenn test fire. And that rocket does not exist anymore. They have another rocket, but they don't have another pad. So like stage 0 is a real thing. You need a pad. They're going to be a while before they have a pad again. But the FCC filing for Amazon LEO is 3,300 satellites to build in a competing network, essentially, to Starlink. Their satellites are bigger, so they don't need quite as many, and they're in a slightly higher orbit, so this will be slightly more latent. And again, that's not the only one. Then we get to the Chinese. The Chinese are actually working on 3 different mega constellation sets. The main one is called Thousand Sails. It's out of a company in Shanghai. They've already flown 750 satellites. This is one of their launches. Their goal is to get to global coverage by 2027, so another year and a half, 15,000 satellites by 2030. Then there's a military network and a different form of commercial network that they're working on that both are in the thousands of satellites. So if you're doing the math here with me, we're at about 35,000 to 40,000 satellites total. And collisions are a problem. We really don't want them. Now, the thing we care most about when we talk about satellite collisions is the International Space Station. It's the largest object in space by a long way. It's the size of a football pitch, weighs 450 tons, and it has 6 to 11 people on it, which we'd like to keep alive. Now, if we back up to before Starlink started, back in 2019, space station was already up there. There was about 2,000 operational satellites in the world back then. 20,000 objects being tracked in total. Pieces of old spacecraft, dead satellites, explosion debris from anti-satellite missions, that kind of thing. And at that time, we have ground-based radars that are tracking all of those objects and maintaining a map. And they would communicate, we would let a satellite operator know, typically up to 60 days before a potential, what they called a conjunction. So your satellite and another object are going to become within less than a kilometer of each other. For the space station, it's 3 kilometers. And so in those times, and again, this is pre-Starlink, so 2019, they would expect to move the space station, which has fairly powerful thrusters, once or twice a year for the decrease the chance of debris. They would actually get notifications of potential collisions every day, maybe a dozen. But as soon as they get that notification, they would aim radar at the area where they thought the collision might be, get more detailed maps of the objects in motion. And some of these objects are less than 10 centimeters, like they're small. And once they knew more precisely how they were moving, most of the time it's like, okay, well, they're not going to collide, it's fine. Once in a while, like many satellite operators would go with no requests to move at all back then. Once you add Starlink to the mix, like SpaceX lowered the price of flight, so the number of satellites has just gone up, even without Starlink, right? There were less than 2,000 satellites in 2019. Today, there's 4,500, plus Starlink's 9,000. But Starlink satellites all fly in related shell orbits, and so they're in constant communication with each other and literally do tens of thousands of maneuvers a year. Most Starlink satellites maneuver almost every day now, just to keep that network of 9,500 satellites in their various shells from colliding with each other. It's put a lot more pressure on the ISS. The ISS now gets radar checked for debris around it 3 times a day. And while largely NASA stopped talking about how often they maneuver, the current estimate is they're maneuvering every other month. They're avoiding debris. So our collision risks have grown dramatically. There's more debris and there's more objects. These days, they figure we're tracking about 50,000 objects. So of those 50,000, we've got about the 15,000 active satellites, about 1,500 defunct satellites, around 2,000 rocket bodies, which are the real problem. They're 1 to 8 metric tons. And then everything else is debris 10 centimeters and bigger. Anything smaller than that, we can't track. So your individual nuts and bolts and flakes of paint and so forth, which are all still hazardous, they're basically not trackable. But stuff over 10 centimeters, A, it's trackable, and B, it impacts hard enough that it will destroy things. So we track it all. So we've gone from 20,000 objects 25, 26 years ago to 50,000 objects today. There was a research group called MITRE that did a study, what they called the satellite carrying capacity. This is back in 2024. What they really, the question was, how many satellites in low Earth orbit is too many? And one of the things they talked about was these coordination systems. So the same way that Starlink wrote some fairly advanced software to have the satellites avoid each other, less direct human intervention, if we had all of the satellites doing that, all subscribing to the same network, and I'm including the Chinese satellites, which is going to be tricky, then we could carry as many as 100,000 satellites in low Earth orbit. That was MITRE's estimation. Now, that's a lot of satellites. But remember, we're almost going to get to half of that just with the communication constellations that are on the books right now. So where's the room for the AI data centers? Now, Elon, again, was talking about millions. Well, Elon is prone to exaggeration. And realistically, we're talking maybe 10,000, 20,000 at most before we get close to carrying capacity. And that's not mitigating the debris. The satellite sensors are not capable of detecting the debris. That has to be done from the ground and relayed to the system. We can put automation around it to try and make it better, but we have to unify all the networks to make that work. And the issue here is something famously called Kessler syndrome. And Kessler syndrome is this idea that any given collision generates enough debris to make more collisions inevitable over and over and over again until literally whole orbits are littered with debris. And remember that every collision imparts enough energy that you're going to put particles in other orbits. They're going to spread up and down. And so we get to a point where it's very hard to deal with all of that debris. Now, for years, we've been working on debris issues. The first and most important are what we call rocket bodies. This is actually one of the very few photographs of a rocket body. Second stages, typically. And the point with these second stages is that they should be deorbited after they're used. So they're supposed to hold back enough fuel. And this is normal today, at least for Western rockets. So a second stage off of a Falcon 9, even the New Glenn rocket, they will very deliberately, after they deploy their payload, turn around and burn to slow down enough to know exactly where they're going to drop that rocket body. The thing with these rocket bodies is they're big enough and they're hard enough that stuff makes it to the ground. And so it's important to drop them in the ocean. And for the most part, we do that. The notable exception are the Chinese. The Chinese are flying a lot of rockets, not anywhere near as much as SpaceX, but enough, and they tend not to deorbit their second stages. Now, you can't always deorbit a second stage. There are certain orbits, especially geostationary orbits, where you put the rocket up so high, you don't have enough energy to bring it back down. And there are still things you can do to make it far less dangerous. The main thing is to dump its fuel and depressurize it, because an old rocket body with fuel in it still is prone to exploding. And one big 5-ton piece of metal is hazardous, but 5 tons of shrapnel is far more hazardous. And so well-behaved rockets depressurize if they can't deorbit. I mean, everything's going to come down eventually. But once you get much above low Earth orbit, the deorbit times are in hundreds of years. These big objects, and there's a couple of thousand of them. They are big, but they're very trackable because they're large and they're somewhat reasonable to manage. For satellites, same thing. As satellites age out, before they run out of fuel, which is typically the age limit of a satellite burns a certain amount of fuel every year to do station keeping, collision avoidance, and so forth. When that fuel load gets too low, they should deorbit themselves. So they use the last of their fuel this is actually, the picture's wrong. They're facing the direction of flight. This would make your orbit rise, not lower. They should turn around, burn the other way to put themselves down into the atmosphere quickly, deorbit safely. There are also passive deorbit systems that we've been experimenting with, like solar sails. Solar sails are real. The pressure of the solar wind can actually affect a satellite. And so one of the proposals, and these have been experimented with but not put into production, is a solar sail that you unfold and then orient the satellite so that the solar pressure slows the satellite down to deorbit it rapidly. There's also tether methods. They're all fairly passive techniques for deorbiting. And that presumes that you're doing the responsible thing and mitigating your satellite before it becomes debris. So it's not going to do much of the debris that's already up there, but it's a way to limit the amount of debris. Starlink runs in such low orbits that just normal atmospheric drag will deorbit their satellites within 5 years, which means they now have a constant process now to replace the satellites they're losing. We only have a 5-year lifespan on 12,000 satellites, divide by 5. You get an idea of just how many satellites they've got. They've got to replace a couple of thousand satellites a year just to maintain the network. But it decreases the issue of needing to deorbit them. For the inerts, or the real debris, we have a bunch of experimental proposals, nets and harpoons, different systems to capture that debris and deorbit it. So for the biggest pieces, this, like the rocket bodies, this somewhat makes sense. For the smaller pieces, it's more laser-based. I know it sounds cool, but it's actually a fairly practical thing that if you heat an object up enough, it will actually decelerate it. If you heat it in the right direction to cause it to deorbit more quickly. Probably going to be a combination of these things. When we talk about the 2,000 rocket bodies, the most likely thing to do here is to actually do mechanical deorbiting. So robot capture and deliberate reentry. It's expensive, but it gets those rocket bodies out of play. And then for your mid-sized debris, the stuff that's 100 centimeters to 10 centimeters, these netting systems, so forth, would be the way to get that. And everything small, lasers and ion units to slow them down to try and deorbit them. So try to reduce the overall debris, to decrease the risk, to try and maintain these networks. And again, even before these problems have existed, before the AI data centers in space concept. If we're going to do these multiple communication networks, we're going to have to manage our debris better than we're doing it. But we're still trying to figure out if any of this makes any sense. I've worked through all the numbers for you. I'm not saying it's impossible. We can debate the particular costs. We know that the things they're proposing mostly are going to be limited by communication. They're only going to be able to do inference as long as they're big enough. What were they actually trying to accomplish here? There's one argument that the threat to go into space was to push more municipalities to allow more data centers to be built. It's not like we're actually going to run out of land, but we are having problems with power. And to be clear, no power plants have been built for AI data centers so far. It takes about 5 years to build a power plant, and this craziness has only been going on for 3. The reality is no data centers have been built either, other than data centers that were already being built. So a lot of this is pure hype right? This is taking the slope of the graph, pointing directly upward and going, we need more of everything. Doesn't mean that it's real, just that it's a good way to convince investors to put more money in. And for the most part, the only people who are really talking about this are the Y Combinator types, the star clouds and so forth, that have got nothing to lose, except for SpaceX. SpaceX keeps talking about this. And funny that we're right at a time when they're getting ready to IPO the company. Now, let me remind you all of a few things when we talk about this IPO, and I'm sorry this is so bright. First, when Elon created SpaceX, he said very specifically, I am not going to IPO this company because my goal is to put men on, to build a city on Mars. That's not a business, and IPOing it would make that impossible. So he's clearly thrown that story away, because if you're really going to IPO this thing, no shareholder is going to put up with the amount of money you're going to need to spend to put people on Mars with no possible revenue stream in sight. So why is he doing it? Let's talk about what it means to be a billionaire. So there's only one way to become a billionaire, and that is to own a huge interest in a company that gets valued for lots and lots of billions. And when you do that, you don't sell your stock because that reduces the value of the stock, and you have to pay capital gains and all those other fun things. So what you do instead is you borrow against your stock. You basically commit chunks of your stock at a certain valuation to be sold when it hits that value, but you don't want to sell it. You just maintain the loan. And Elon has borrowed billions against Tesla, his only publicly traded company. And I don't know if you've noticed, but lately, Tesla's not been doing that well. Now, his goal with Tesla, and he said this out front, was to make the electric car real. And he's done that. The problem now is there's a whole bunch of other companies making electric cars that are pretty darn good. And he's not been doing a lot of innovation in that space. You notice he's not talking about electric cars to Tesla at all. He talks about robo-taxis and robots because we don't know how to value those, so it keeps the stock price up. There's been lots of folks talking about how close he is to his strike prices because that would be a catastrophe for him to be forced to sell all that stock to pay off those loans. It would tank Tesla and it would tank his net worth, and we wouldn't want that. But if you IPO another company, you could move the loans over and unload Tesla from that burden. The trick here is to make sure you make that IPO as big as it can possibly be. And here's the problem when you're SpaceX. You already own the launch market. You're the cheapest flight into space. You fly everybody that can fly on you already. You dominate utterly. And your main customer is you. It's Starlink. And you finished that network. Well, how the heck can you get $1 trillion valuation out of a business you already completely own? You need another business. And so in the IPO offering, they listed out all of the different businesses. Their space-enabled solutions, the Starlink broadband. I mean, they're worth billions. They're big companies. Starlink Mobile. And then the AI stuff is trillions. Current proposed values, $26 trillion. Now, also in the IPO is a little section where they go, there are some concerns about the number of satellites that can be operated in space that might impact the value of this offering. But that's several pages down. You probably won't read that part. And we are weeks away from this IPO. So this is the hype cycle run amok, essentially, to create a valuation large enough to do a multi-trillion-dollar IPO. Also, this guy can protect his money, impede the mission, propose things that are questionable at best. It makes sense from that perspective. Does it make sense to build these things? Look, we're going to need computers in space, but not to use on Earth. We'll put them around the moon when we need compute around the moon, because being a couple of seconds away from the Earth doing compute back and forth, that's going to suck too, right? You're going to want compute up there. Sticking it in low Earth orbit is crazy. Sticking it purely in a sun-synchronous orbit, because you have a limited amount of battery space, that's even crazier. Now you're increasing your collision risk. You're narrowing the space where those satellites can fly. It's even going to be hard to deorbit them with that much traffic going up there. And they're limited. They can only do certain workloads. I'm not convinced that they won't fly a few of these because it's interesting business. I'm not convinced that they won't try and optimize. There's more to be done here. We haven't talked about radiation problems or any of that stuff. We don't need to. We already got enough complexity as it is. But does it actually make a substantial difference to the overall network? Here's a question for you. How much of the internet travels over Starlink? It's 9,000 satellites. It's huge. Each one of those satellites can handle at optimal 60 gigabits of traffic. So combined, if we round them all up together, it's about 600 terabits. Less than 1%. One undersea cable, one modern undersea cable, is 480 gigabits. Two of them is more than all of Starlink combined. We have 1,700 cables worldwide. They just can't move that much data. It's hard to beat the wire, and the wires are short. They're fast. Low Earth orbit's pretty quick, but it's only so dense. We can only haul so much data. So it's not practical at large scale. The amount, you know the math I don't have because nobody wants to share the numbers. Just how much compute have we got in these data centers today? What fraction of it could possibly put into orbit? I'm betting it's going to come in at less than 1%. For that amount of expense, complexity, and risk, it's very suspect. But I can see a motivation for why we'd be talking about it right now. I just wonder if we're going to be talking about it next year. I hope this was useful to you. Thank you so much for coming out to this, and I hope you have a great day tomorrow. Thanks. I'll happily take any questions if you guys want to talk further. We're just at the party next door, so whenever that noise comes, we can go from there. This is my first attempt at trying to put all these numbers together. I hope I put some bits together. If there's something missing, please let me know. Anyone have questions? Sir? What? Oh, the actual cost? I mean, the satellites have never been the expense. The launch platform's always been the big expense, right? And you figure Falcon 9 is about 1,800 a kilo. So for flying, 15-ton satellites, they're going to, we're talking 50, 60 million per flight per satellite. The actual cost of the vehicle of the satellite itself, $3 million for the main plant. The solar panels are barely going to be $1 million. The cooler is going to be more expensive because that cooling system's pretty elaborate. But I think all up, these satellites are maybe going to be $20, $30 million. Like, they're not wildly expensive. And still, the lift is going to be twice the price of the satellite. And that tracks, right? Until you get to national space assets like those spy satellites and so forth, billion-dollar satellites is the only time you see those kinds of things. These ones are going to be tens of millions of dollars, I think. But we'll see. I'm trying to anticipate all the problems, but I don't know that I have. Sir? A space tether. I've done a whole hour on that in the Geek Outs, if you look for it. It's pretty science fiction-y. So we have material that's sufficiently strong for the tensile strength that would be necessary to do a cable from the surface of the Earth to geostationary and above. But we've only built those in sub-millimeter lengths, right? The carbon nanotubes, and you need 60,000 kilometers of that, and a whole bunch, because we're going to need some of them to hang out together. Here's the biggest problem with a space tether. Just totally off track, but if you guys are okay with this, I can do Geek Out all day. Now I put you in a cart on a 60,000 kilometer long line up to a station up above for you to take off from. How fast can I make that cart move? And I'll tell you why that's important. Because going up that cable, we're going to go through both Van Allen belts at their thickest points with high levels of radiation. So let's make us book it, like hauling ass, 2,000, 3,000 kilometers an hour. You're still going to spend days going up. And the radiation's going to kill you before you get there. Now, how do we do this with Artemis 2? Because we just did it with Artemis 2, right? In April, we flew 2 people through the Van Allen belts. Well, we didn't actually. What we did is we put them up in a high inclination orbit so that they went, when they took off for the moon, they went through close to the poles where the Van Allen belt's the smallest. We were also moving at 50,000 kilometers an hour. And so we cleared those belts in a couple of minutes. So the big problem with space tether on the Earth is going through the atmosphere, right? And dealing with all of that. But now that we have reusable rockets or almost reusable rockets, it almost doesn't matter, right? If Starship works the way it's supposed to, we're going to be down in the $100 per kilo space. And that's not almost price competitive with a tether. The place for a tether would be the far side of the moon. So this is another geek out, but there's a geek out about building civilization into space, like actually become a spacefaring civilization. And the far side of the moon is this magical place. It's got a lot of resources. It's relatively quiet. The gravity's low enough that a tether will work a charm. You can use Kevlar for that tether. It's easy. But the main thing is once you're out at that at the end of that tether, You only need a couple of thousand delta V to virtually any point in the solar system. It's super efficient to come and go from. And if you're going to start adding asteroids, which I think you should do, the logical place for you to bring the resources to is that same spot. A, chance of collision with the Earth is extremely low. Colliding with the moon is higher. We don't care that much about the moon. It's going to be okay. And it's a great place to build spacecraft from. So as we build up the infrastructure to actually operate on the moon, we start taking advantage of that far side. Those are the kinds of things we'll put up there and become a spacefaring civilization. Live and work in space, not just do science, but explore, do more. Mar? Sir? 5,000 years? Yes. Well, I mean, for the we don't have to do that in 5,000 years, right? We've got missions to asteroids now. We could be mining in 100 years. You know, realistically, there's no technological barriers to doing this. It's a bit of engineering left to go. So it's fairly feasible. The math for deorbiting mass back to Earth is bad. So in general, it makes very little sense to take resources and bring it back to Earth. Manufacturing products in space with those resources makes a heck of a lot more sense, right? Like there's several products we could be building in geostationary space or space in the LEO space system between the Earth and the moon that would actually be better than the stuff we can make on the Earth. Starting with solar panels. Anytime you need to grow a crystal, gravity is your enemy. And so we need to do more experiments, and we've already done some of this in the space station, with doing more crystal growing up in low gravity environments. Same for fiber optic cable. If we had a bit more room to work. In fact, all of the ingredients for making solar panels are on the moon. It would be a great place to make them. They would naturally be superior quality just because it's easier to form crystals up there. And that's the real thing that's going to happen over time is we're going to gradually learn about a set of products we can make in these different environments that are superior to the Earth environment. And that's the stuff we'll be bringing to build back down. Don't send down the raw materials, make the superior product. That'll take some time, but it's possible. And we already have some scope on a few of them. Data centers on Titan. Well, we got the cooling part nailed because it's like negative 200 degrees there. Look, we're going to want data centers wherever we have compute requirements, right? The only place that this makes no sense is LEO. Pretty much everywhere else that we're going to need compute requirements, we're probably going to move a certain amount of compute. I don't see how, now that we're watching generative AI models be such a key part of science, you don't think we're going to call a couple of racks up to the base on the moon? That makes pretty good sense, right? Just do those workloads locally, run them on solar power, on the small nuclear. Are we going to get humans to Titan? One of these days, you're going to need a warm jacket. It's negative 200 something. It's cold there, but the gravity's low and the atmosphere is thick enough that with the right pair of wings, you should be able to flap and fly. But it's going to rain ethane on you. And I would say, don't worry about lighting a match because there's no oxygen to be found anywhere there. It's in the ice. You're going to have to dig the ice out to operate all that. But we got a couple of missions going to Titan now. I'm looking forward to those. So I may live long enough to see the Dragonfly mission. That'll be exciting. Yes.
What do you think will happen regarding
Ownership of space. Oh, you don't want to open a can of worms now, do you? So we've got the Outer Space Treaty of 1967, right? Back when it was only the Soviets and the Americans, and we kind of made this deal, said, hey, we're going to treat space like Antarctica. And Antarctica gives us a pretty good example of what's most likely to happen. Yeah, nobody owns Antarctica, but you don't really go into the American sector without letting the Americans know, and they get pretty upset if you do, and same for the Russian sector. And the Norwegian sector, you know, that's the normal pattern. And what we're seeing in the conversations about stuff happening on the moon is exactly that. That you get there, put some stuff down, you can request and demand an exclusion zone. Hey, don't come around here. And the Chinese seem to be playing this game fairly well. They're working on landers specifically to put payloads down, most likely radioactive payloads, to create exclusion zones. So yeah, we're going to have problems about that. And admittedly, that treaty is 80 years old. It probably needs some updating. People are going to find a way to work around it to some degree because treaties and agreements are only as good as their enforcement. Just ask the GDPR. Any more? Should I just start doing geek out talks at these shows where I just like geek out, whatever you guys want, bring your questions and we'll go. Maybe next time. Okay, thank you. Thanks so much.